Good morning to everyone here in Europe, and good afternoon or evening to everyone joining in Asia. I'm Nick Crawford, a researcher on the geoeconomics program here at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on trade and power in Asia-Pacific after RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. We have a fantastic panel here to discuss trade in Asia. Joining me are Alicia Garcia Herrero, Chief Economist for Asia Pacific at Natixis and a Senior Fellow at Bruegel; Tim Harcourt, Professor of Practice in Economics at the University of New South Wales at the Business School, also known to many of you, I'm sure, as the Airport Economist; Janet Powell, Hong Kong Director of the Economist Corporate Network; and Robert Ward, Japan Chair and Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy at the IISS. The webinar today will be discursive in style. I'll direct questions at our panel for around the first 45 minutes, and then we'll have 30 minutes for questions from you. When it comes to asking questions, there are two ways you can do this. You can type questions into the Q&A, or you can raise your hand to ask questions orally. If you've raised your hand and I call on you to ask your question, we will unmute you. So give us a few seconds, and then please make sure you also unmute yourself. Please feel free to type questions at any time during the webinar, and I'll try also to pick some up as we go along. So let's begin. As we all know, at the end of last year, ASEAN states, China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand concluded negotiations for RCEP. The agreement lowers tariffs between the parties, harmonizes rules of origins, and includes agreement on various other non-tariff barriers on trade. So I want to begin perhaps with you, Robert. What is the significance of RCEP?
Thank you, Nick, and wonderful to be on this panel with these fantastic guests as well. So, and a very important subject. The RCEP crowned what in the circumstances was a pretty good year for China, COVID notwithstanding, and I view RCEP for Xi Jinping as a really significant geopolitical win for China as well. I think we'll be talking about that, about why over the course of this webinar. In terms of trade impact, well, the region Asia is already threaded with trade deals. If you do a chart of all the deals, all the trade agreements within Asia, it really does look like the proverbial spaghetti bowl. So in terms of actual positive impact on trade, I suspect it's not going to be hugely significant. There are some positives in the deal, largely around the trimming of red tape, harmonization of rules of origin, for example. But it is a much looser deal. It's not like the CPTPP, about which we will also be talking, I'm sure, in this webinar. It's not as prescriptive as that. And there are good reasons why it wouldn't be prescriptive, because the economic development stage of the countries in RCEP are all quite disparate, and many of the countries are at a very emerging level still. But what it does, I think, for China is to reinforce China's the interdependence of the region with China. And I think you have to look at RCEP in line with the other things that China's doing around trying to push its vision for rules and standards. Regulations and rules, standards, regulations are where the geopolitical battles will be fought in part going forward. And also with regard to what it's doing with the digital renminbi, which is very interesting, partly because China's version is centrally controlled, as you'd expect, because it's China and the government wants to control everything. But China's creating networks in the region with potential networks that the renminbi can be used more widely, particularly if capital controls are loosened. So there's lots of geopolitical reasons, I think, why Xi Jinping will be very, very pleased with this deal indeed.
Thanks, Robert. I'd like to follow up on one of your points with Alicia. Alicia, in your assessment, what does RCEP mean for the economic interdependence of Asia-Pacific? Does RCEP really tie the fates of other Asia-Pacific economies to China's any more than they would have been otherwise? And also, what are the gains for RCEP's other signatories?
Well, first, thanks for inviting me to this very interesting seminar. It's a pleasure to be here. I actually quite agree with Robert's statement on, yes, this is geopolitically very important for China. It comes at the worst of all times for the US. And in the interim, of course, of a change in administration. So in a way, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I'm not surprised by RCEP actually coming to a real deal end of the year or close to end of the year. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the supply chain, which was already very China-centric before RCEP, will become more. And the reason is exactly in that very same sentence. It was already too China-centric. So, it's very hard to get more of something you already feel you have too much of. That's a very simple concept, but it says a lot about what I mean to say here, which is that China already was playing a major role as an investor, as a provider of exports, and as, most importantly, an importer of parts and components for some countries more than others. Malaysia is a very good example, Vietnam. So I think what RCEP stands is that, it would be great to have more for China, but on the other hand, countries want to have less. And if you want a very clear example of this, we just got a report of, this very famous survey that we get every year from ICS and the state of the Southeast Asia, and where it basically shows that no matter the terrible news from the US in 2020, for obvious reasons, when Southeast Asian economies are asked, who would you align with if you had to align with either China or the US, actually the respondents in favor of aligning with China have gone down from 2020 to 2021 from 46 to 38%. So, in other words, I think because of that centrality of China in the value chain, which was really your question, I doubt that countries want to get even further into that. And you have this China plus policy, which is very important in the region. Yeah, the idea being build parallel value chains, perhaps actually more ASEAN centric. And I think, let's not forget, RCEP is still, ASEAN centrality plays a major role in it. That's how it started. And we can't forget, we have also South Korea and Japan. So the largest investors still today in ASEAN are actually South Korea, Japan, and somebody that indeed is going to lose quite a lot from RCEP, which is Taiwan. So I leave it here to give more space for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. You mentioned, Alicia, an interest in being perhaps less dependent on China, if I understand you correctly. Perhaps particularly there's some wariness amongst governments in the region. Do you think the same holds true of businesses in the region, or do they continue to see China as the best possible source for their own business growth? And can that bridge or that gap between business attitudes and government attitudes be bridged, do you think?
Well, it's a great question. And this is not only true for Southeast Asia, this is true for Europe, and it's true for, I guess, most part of the world. You have also, a lot of lobbying going on in the US to basically, on the semiconductor space, to kind of keep things as they are. Yeah, so absolutely. However, even from a business point of view, if you have something like, Biden's executive order on basically cleaning the supply chain from China components at the very, end of the spectrum for electric vehicles, semiconductors, you may not want to be caught in that. Yeah, I mean, basically, you may love to be exporting to China if you're a business oriented towards China's domestic market, i.e., retail or you name it. Yeah, I mean, consumer goods basically. But you might not be as comfortable if you are an exporter of intermediate goods, because you may have to choose. Yeah, you may have to choose if this executive order actually comes to to becoming what we are expecting. So, and it's not only the executive order, I mean, there's many more things there. Yeah, so entity list, you name it. So in that regard, I think you want to keep your options, and that's why I'm saying if you are already very involved, you may want to create a new value chain separate from that. And RCEP is fine, but it's fine for consumer goods, it's fine for maybe commodities, it's fine for, I'm not sure it's fine as much for inputs to production, i.e. Supply chain. That's the key question, really. I'm not saying it won't happen, but it's not guaranteed. RCEP can't guarantee that.
Janet, the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on Trans-Pacific Partnership, goes further in many ways than RCEP. Could you explain a little bit for us how the two agreements fit together?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Nick, on this panel. Wonderful to have a discussion with all of you here. So CPTPP is generally seen as a trade agreement that has higher standards than RCEP in many areas, and particularly in the area of digital services, which RCEP doesn't really touch on very much. It touches on e-commerce, but on digital services, it doesn't really have, it opens up the discussion, but it doesn't have anything binding on it. And non-compliance doesn't really yield any negative punishment for the signatories. So I think for China, partly because of what Robert and Alicia were mentioning, that it benefits from this tidying up of the patchwork of pre-existing free trade agreements. It opens up more production bases and hopefully more consumption bases for China, especially in e-commerce areas. So it is good for China, and China is happy to participate in it. CPTPP, President Xi in China had mentioned that, well, maybe we would consider it. However, I think there's not very much political appetite at this point, because of what I was saying in terms of the CPTPP requiring China to attain pretty high standards. And this is on digital services, but also on subsidies, on SOEs. These would, in a way, even counter some of Chinese domestic regulations. And so I think that while I think it's geopolitically symbolic that China says, well, maybe we will consider joining CPTPP. This is really a talking point to the US saying, here's the regionalization happening and you're not part of it. So I think that has more significance than the reality of China joining CPTPP.
With these agreements as sort of talking points and the potential counterpoint to RCEP is an expansion of CPTPP to take in some other countries. Potential candidates include Taiwan, the UK, the US. What do you think the prospects are for an expansion of CPTPP, Janet?
Yeah, I think there's very little appetite currently for the US to join the CPTPP. There's probably more appetite than in the past 4 years under the Trump administration, because people think that the Biden administration is going to be more of a defender of the multilateral trading system, more akin to some of both the Republican and Democratic predecessors in the White House. However, right now, there really is no consensus, and there's a bipartisan opposition actually to trade agreements, I would look at whether the Biden administration will renew the Trade Promotion Authority. I think it's going to be in July 2021, and that will provide a bellwether of whether there would be any even discussions in Congress about these trade agreements. And if there's not, I think that this is really a ship that has sailed, the US's so-called pivot to Asia. However, I think that one opening wedge for the US to maybe increase its influence in Asia is this free and open Indo-Pacific construct, which is now really mostly a geopolitical and security construct. And the economic dimensions, as I understand, are really either secondary or we really haven't heard very much about it. I don't think the US will go back into the CPTPP discussions. However, because under the Biden administration and the government, those who are in charge of Asia have really put FOIP, FOIP, as a priority. There may be a possibility for the US to strengthen its presence in Asia. And I think that a must would be to make the theme economic, so such as strengthening supply chain resilience and also technology standards. But of course, that would be a very different construct than what we're seeing with RCEP. And I don't think that there would be a support from China on something like that, of course.
Tim, is there an appetite in Australia for an expansion of CPTPP to take in some of the other, perhaps middle power, smaller states, the likes of the United Kingdom, which has already applied, South Korea, Taiwan?
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and thanks for having me, and thanks for having Australia on the panel. I was really taken by Janet's analysis of CTPP, and it reminded me of some analysis done by some of my trade policy colleagues in Australia. And as you know, Australians love sports and horse racing, and my colleagues went through the entire candidates for the CTPPP in terms of horse race, in terms of a horse race and possible horses, and they described the favourite to join as Korea. No surprises there with its sophisticated economy and way up the value chain and digital services. Their second up, the game changer, was the United States, and depending on whether Biden, as Janet said, can redo the damage done by Trump, they described the swooper as the United Kingdom, it really took the Australian authorities by surprise that the UK was trying to do this. We actually found before Brexit, where we did the Airport Economist Brexit special, we found it pretty cosy, the UK getting tangled up in Brussels, because it meant that the UK was hardly competing with us in Asia at all. And so it was a bit annoying now that Britain's going to now discover the world again, and we're going to have to compete. In fact, at one stage, I think Prince Andrew was the British advocate for trade and investment for the UK trade authorities. We thought that was a really good arrangement, because I think Australia got a lot of deals when Prince Andrew was in that job. And then, not surprisingly, the horse race analogy agreed with Janet in that it had both China and Taiwan as dark horses. And indeed, it's interesting in what Alicia said about RCEP. It really is an ASEAN-led agreement and a super regional agreement, but at the same time, very useful to China for that reason. And I was quite taken by Alicia's comments about business versus geopolitics, because in Australia, as you know, we've had an incredibly successful relationship with China. Chinese Australians have built the retail sector in Australia. They've built in fact, when they came to Australia to the gold rushes, they built the first department stores and emporiums and went back to China and set them up in Shanghai and Guangzhou. So Chinese Australians have made an incredible contribution to Australia, and Australia's had a fruitful relationship with China since Gough Whitlam went to Peking ahead of Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon in 1971. But we are having troubles at the moment. And what's interesting is that there's almost a blue corner and a red corner. And the blue corner is all defence, cybersecurity people, mainly in Canberra, and they see everything through the prism of cybersecurity and geopolitics and Huawei and intelligence and IP. And they're running this line that Australia can just simply diversify and start selling its barley to Indonesia and start diversifying, selling more wine to the UK, and it will be quite simple. On the red corner, there's most business leaders in Australia and exporters say that, well, come on. I mean, China is our leading trade partner, exports and imports. If you took the middle class growth in China, it would take the growth of adding India, ASEAN and the USA together. So you can't turn your back on China. And they almost take the view that business is business. You've got to do whatever you can to lock in those agreements. So we're going through quite an interesting debate whereby, in some ways, like in politics now, two extremes are dominating the debate. The red corner talking about mainly business interests and trade, and the blue corner talking about cybersecurity. Whilst in the middle ground, there's people like myself that believe that you have to have a very strategic engagement with China, and we're not going to agree with everything China does, and nor are they going to agree with us. And we're no different than most other countries in the world that from time to time has a bumpy ride, but has overall a reasonable strategic engagement with China.
As you say, Australia has had a bumpy ride with China over the last year. Beijing responded to the Australian government's calls for an inquiry into the origins of COVID with numerous trade restrictions, imports of beef, barley, wine, and imports of copper and coal dropped off too. And Australia's not been the only one to be targeted in this way. In 2019, trade with Canada was also targeted following the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei. And before that, well, Taiwan has been targeted, Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines as well. Tim, how much of an impact economically have the trade restrictions from Beijing had on Australia?
You've almost got to say, Nick, with our national accounts yesterday, where I think we've got one of the strongest GDP numbers in the world, that perhaps China helped us again, like they did in the global financial crisis and the dot-com crash again. There's big headlines, and you heard, as you say, beef and barley and wine and timber. The barley growers managed to ship their goods to the Middle East and Africa, and the cotton growers picked up Indonesia and Thailand and Vietnam. Apparently, the UK has picked up wine consumption by 29% from Australia. So that lockdown must be really doing good things for Australian wine growers. For the most part, because the iron ore price has been high, trade to China is actually quite robust. And I think in some ways, I gave a speech to the Sydney Institute, and the other speaker was the former Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, who's now the Special UK Trade Representative, advisor. It's interesting in some ways, Australia needs China, a very important trading partner, very important import source, and very important for tourism and students, as well as rocks and crops, mining and agriculture. But, well, China needs Australia too, in terms of energy security and food security and quality education for the younger generation. So despite a lot of the rhetoric coming out of Beijing and the counterparts in Canberra and some of the think tanks, the relationship's still quite strong in a business sense. It's still quite robust, and in some ways, Chinese and Australian consumers are still doing what they want to do, and so are Australian and Chinese businesses. We're just making a new TV show after the pandemic, actually looking at the China-Australia relationship, and the huge expansion of Chinese entrepreneurs in Australia, many of whom are international students, has been very, very helpful. Bob Hawke, when he had tears to his eyes and he let all the students in after Tiananmen Square, basically built up a whole growth of Chinese Australian entrepreneurs who are former students. And even last week, I interviewed some Chinese students who'd become entrepreneurs, providing services to Chinese students in Australia who had been either in Australia working out how they engage with banks and businesses and how they set themselves up at their universities, but also the ones that are stuck back in China because of COVID. They're actually helping them keep up to date with online courses and storing their luggage and looking after them that way. So in some ways, there's rhetoric and the political level, many of it driven by geopolitics, but yet in a business sense, in a people-to-people student university sense, it's almost like it's never been so good, and probably showing why our economic numbers are a little bit more robust than we had expected coming up, to this part of the year.
Janet, we've spoken about Australia's perspective on these punitive trade measures. What are other Asian Pacific states' perspectives on this? Alicia's also mentioned a sort of nervousness about economic dependence on China. Has there been much attention paid to the trade restrictions on Australia? And is it a subject of sort of active discussion among governments?
Yeah, so I work at the Economist Corporate Network with a lot of business leaders who run the region for multinational companies. And with the Australia, the slew of bans and sanctions on Australia, I would use a Chinese proverb that people see it as something, measures that kill the chicken to warn the monkey. So the monkeys are basically other economies who are worried that what has happened to Australian barley, Australian wine, Australian beef, Australian coal would happen to them. And to quote one of, I think, Alicia's point earlier, nobody really wants to be forced to choose. But at the same time, I think for multinational businesses, their calculation of cost versus resilience has changed fundamentally. And a lot of multinationals who have been producing in China are now looking at the China +1 supply chain. And this is not something that was just due to COVID. It actually predates COVID, because in the past number of years, companies, and I think Japanese auto is a good example. They have already, even though they know that supply chains for particular components are really sticky and costly to move, they have been more willing to pay more in order to build the resilience that in the past they didn't find the urgency to do. Of course, COVID has really brought into focus the risk of disruption of supply chains, and thus it has accelerated changes in a lot of sectors in a lot of countries where companies are paying more, willing to invest more just in case something happens, as opposed to the just-in-time model of the past. And actually, I think a good example that reminds me, what it reminds me of in terms of countries wanting to decrease reliance on China for supply chains, is that about 10 years ago, some of you will remember that China blocked the rare earth mineral exports to Japan following a maritime dispute. And what happened was that, okay, well, 95% of the rare minerals were from China. So what would other countries do? So what Japan did was that it actually lodged a complaint at the WTO, and it got the US and the EU to join, and eventually China backed down. So in terms of this decreased dependence on China, I mean, I think this is something that a lot of countries and a lot of sectors think that they have to do. However, it is actually very costly and difficult to do. So the reason I bring up this rare earth issue is because they have to find alternatives, right? So what the Biden administration is talking about, working with partners on a coordinated approach, that is really about finding alternatives. Okay, so if you don't want to be highly dependent on China for rare earths or whatever, you're going to go to the WTO together with other people, who are unhappy with this, or you work with others so that you can find alternative materials. So in the rare earth case, they were able to find other deposits in friendly countries like Australia, Canada, Brazil, and so forth. So I think people like to talk about decreasing dependence, but you have to have an alternative.
Tim, you want to jump in here?
Yeah. Janet made a good point. A lot of business people in the Economist Corporate Network, including the ones that I interview, a lot of Western business people like to quote Chinese proverbs to show they're good people to the Chinese, even if they can't speak Mandarin or that don't know any economics or history. So they have that monkey, kill the chicken to warn the monkey expression. I've often heard it from Western people back to Chinese people many times this year. It just reminds me of another, not a proverb, but there's a Woody Allen movie where he says to this guy, "My brother-in-law thinks he's a chicken." And he says, "Well, why don't you go and get him to see a psychiatrist?" And he goes, "Well, I could, but I need the eggs." So in some ways, China has to be a bit careful, because the actions it's taken against South Korea and the Czech Republic and Brazil and of course Australia that we talk about a lot, with Australia, that they still need the eggs. So I think, first of all, China in some ways has done a lot of harm to itself by taking these sanctions. But at the same time, I agree with Janet that the economic cost of diversifying or decoupling is too much. So it's probably opportune time with RCEP, with the CTPP, where you have rules-based agreements rather than bilateral, rather than just Belt and Road. You've got super multilateral regional agreements that are rules-based. That's probably good news for any country dealing with China. In the same way, it's good when you have to deal with the United States or the EU or any superpower trying to use bilateral power and size to push people around. It's much better to have a multilateral system, or at least a regional system of rules, so you can handle it. But what is it that Joan Robinson used to say? Putting up trade barriers is like putting rocks in your own harbour. In some cases, China has actually hurt itself with a lot of the trade barriers, and perhaps some of the more quiet behaviour now might show that they're reconsidering and using these regional multilateral institutions more effectively.
Robert, Japan is one country that has pursued something like a China +1 strategy, and it's been offering China exit subsidies. How much success is Japan having with this approach?
So before I answer that one, Nick, can I just make two other points that have occurred to me from what the panel's said? One is Janet's point about FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific. And it struck me right between the eyes, actually, because Japan was the originator of the Free and Open Indo-Pacific concept. And it was designed by Abe administration as a tool of economic statecraft. So one of these sort of really important things for Japan is that it isn't geopolitical or in a pure sense, or to do with security. The danger for Japan, I think, is that the FOIP concept and the Indo-Pacific concept, which is a political concept, comes to be seen as a hard security concept. But for Japan, the FOIP idea is all about connectivity, is all about the rules-based order, is all about supporting the rule of law, and so on. So for Japan, it's about openness. And the sort of the interesting point about FOIP, I think, is it is open to China as well. So what Japan's trying to do is to give countries in the region a choice. They don't have to go either China or the US. There is a choice that they can go the middle way, which is around the rules-based order. So Japan's trying to stop countries bandwagoning, smaller countries bandwagoning with with China through this. So I've been making the point to Japanese policymakers that this is a real risk for the FOIP concept as a whole, because if it becomes seen as a security concept, then of course it's far less effective from Japan's point of view. The other point is the elephant that's not in the room with RCEP, which is India. And India now, is the coming superpower, no doubt about that, is geopolitically absolutely vital for the region, is the fulcrum for the Indo-Pacific concept for many, many countries. So really, really vital, and also with India's relations with China, sort of highlighting that now as they've deteriorated. But for India's economy, it really does plough quite a lonely furrow now, because it's the only big economy in the region that's not sort of hooked up to a trade bloc. And this reflects Modi's legitimate concerns about the lack of competitiveness of Indian industry. But India remains pretty closed economy and sheltered from the sort of the brisk winds of competitive improvement. So I think for India, strategically, where it goes from now with these trade blocs will be absolutely vital, because India does need to become more productive, more competitive, and to move up the value chain. In terms of your question, Nick, Japan's been, the rare earths incident in 2010 was well noted, and for Japan this was an absolute turning point. Sort of the scales fell from Japan's eyes about having to deal with China both as its most important market, but also as a really sort of a big risk factor in its security environment. So Japan has tried to reduce rare earth dependence, and sort of moderately successfully, but still remains vulnerable. But I think the thing about Japan is that it spotted early that you do need to de-risk your supply chain. So it has been implementing China +1 for about a decade now, so well ahead of the curve in terms of decoupling. But the bigger question, I think, now is and I think for many countries as well, is how full is this decoupling going to be? And my view is that there's only one China, really, in terms of scale of market, in terms of the quality of its human capital, in terms of scale as well, infrastructure and so on. So really, for somewhere like Japan and other countries in the region, there is no alternative to being in China. Now, the question is, are you in China in a sort of set of global rules, or do you, because of bifurcation, do you have to accommodate sort of lots of different rules to be in China and to be elsewhere as well? So I don't think full decoupling. I think partial decoupling, selective decoupling, some strategic decoupling. But if you look at Japan, I think you can see how other countries will inevitably have to behave as well.
Alicia, this notion of decoupling or improving supply chain resilience comes from both sides, in fact. And the two sessions began in China today, and one of the previewed objectives for the 5-year plan is a strengthening of China's domestic supply chains. What's your sense of what this will mean for China's trade with Asia-Pacific and China's own supply chains? And I don't know if you want to mention anything else we should expect from the two sessions.
Well, this very interesting concept of dual circulation, which basically boils down partially, is not everything, to self-reliance, is, I mean, we focus on self-reliance, but in my opinion, that self-reliance is only for high-end products, for high-end intermediate products. I don't think China wants to close, close the door and throw it to the ocean. It wants to continue to trade, because the second part of dual circulation is actually exports, basically finding new markets, if not reaping even more from the existing markets, because it's hard for China to find new markets, it's everywhere. But the point is, I don't think China can imagine that it can only export. Yeah, I mean, already 2020, China will end the year with a massive current account surplus. So I think the idea is I can import what it can't create bottlenecks, if you see what I mean. Say, I can import commodities because I imagine this is not rare earth metals. This is, oil or copper, or I can always find a substitute. And by the way, I even control the minds of enough countries to make it not happen in terms of bottleneck. I can import low-end, and this is Southeast Asia, low-end parts and components. I can continue to do that, but I might not, the minute I will continue to import semiconductors, which would strangle, if needed, my value chain. So that's the difference, I think. So this means that it's not bad news, frankly speaking, for Southeast Asia. It's actually worse news for, say, Europe, the US, maybe South Korea and Japan, if they decide not to follow through in terms of national entities, i.e. constraints from the US. If they decide to go on the China side, then they're part of that value chain. And then they're in that self-reliant concept, if you see what I mean, because they will be trusted. So I don't think it's only China, my market, only me. It's more about who I can trust and what I'm, however, never mind, not dependent on. That could be commodities from Australia, if Australia were to kind of align even more than perhaps lately, but that's the idea, I think, of dual circulation. Is not to be lonely, is to be well accompanied by those you really trust. That's the idea.
Can I add to what Alicia's saying? And I very much agree with you, Alicia. I think we have to look at what China's interests are going forward. And I think there are two main ones that I see. One is to continue with economic upgrading and generate jobs. That is very, very important because that is the social contract that the government has with the people. The second is to survive in an increasingly hostile external environment for China. So I think for China, this commitment to building domestic capacity is not really new. In fact, I think part of the dual circulation, the part where China wants to be more self-reliant, it is kind of a reincarnation of the Made in China 2025, which was too much, I think, marketed as an industrial policy, and there was a lot of backlash. So China, I don't think they want to do that. Instead, they invented another term for it. But dual circulation also is different because it does have a reform and opening bent, which I think nicely harkens back to maybe the Deng Xiaoping era of continued reform and opening. But of course, it's also different because now it has the self-reliant bent, and also the domestic supply chain strengthening really is in response to the new reality of the coming technological bifurcation, and also this supply chain fragmentation risk that may hurt China. The question to me really is there actually a China model for growth that is beyond what we understand of as market liberalization, which is a proven model of growth generation? I don't know. And China seems to think that there is, or basically to survive, it has to come up with something that allows it to hedge its bets. But I would like to see really what will happen in terms of, especially some of the sectors that China is really emphasizing, for instance, energy conservation, smart manufacturing, and so forth. Those are some of the sectors of the future that are holy grails for economic upgrading and growth that the US wants to win in, China wants to win in. But by increasing self-reliance, can China actually come up with a model in order to win in these sectors? I think that's a big question mark.
Tim, over to you.
Yeah, I was just interested in this term. Perhaps Janet came up with it, or one of our colleagues, but this idea that China was a nation of shippers, and now it's become a nation of shoppers in terms of being very export-led, lower wages. Now wages are higher, local consumption and investment, very much building full employment domestically. And I just recall from two things in the Airport Economist series. One is years ago, I went to a factory in Shenzhen when I was a trade union official, and I said, do you have workers' compensation in China? And it got translated through, and they said, no, if the workers break anything, they don't have to compensate us. And then, 20 years on, I go to the same factory and they say, well, we lose a lot of people to office jobs and to highly paid white collar jobs, comfortable, air conditioned. So we are providing higher wages in this factory, and also piece rates, effectively capitalist measures to retain workers. And it just suggested to me that despite stereotypes of China, of bright lights, big city, and low cost labour, you've got very much a high value added, high tech domestic economy, and many, including Australian manufacturers, have moved to Chengdu and Chongqing and Qingdao because they're building hot water heaters, because everyone in Australia who wants a hot water for their shower has one. But in China, there's that massive internal domestic market. In many ways, we did one of our shows in Qingdao because our winemakers in South Australia were just making wine for Qingdao because there was so much competition with Chile in France and South Africa in Shanghai and Germany that they just decided, we have these second tier, third tier cities of 20, 30 plus million people. It's a fantastic economy in its own right. And that model seems to be working so far. So I think probably Janet's on the money with respect to that.
I'd like to pick up some of the questions from the audience now. If anyone wants to ask their question orally, please do now raise your hand and I'll come to as many of you as I can. But first of all, I'll pick up on one question that's in our written questions. And I'll direct this to you, Tim. You mentioned earlier the UK's application to join CPTPP and some apprehension about that perhaps on Australia's part. But also more widely, the question is, does the panel think that the UK's accession negotiations to CPTPP will be shaped or delayed by the possibility that they'll set a precedent for future accessions, such as China or the US?
Well, that's a fantastic question. First up from participants. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, Australia, all this time since 1957, if not more, not earlier, has tried to find its place in the Asia-Pacific. After Federation, we set up trade offices in Shanghai in the 20s, in Tokyo in the 30s, in Batavia, Jakarta as it is now, in the 40s, and the British Foreign Office closed them all down. In 1957, we signed an agreement with Japan. In the 70s, Gough went to China. The Hawke-Keating reforms of the 80s and 90s basically turned the whole tyranny of distance on its head for Australia. The power proximity replaced the tyranny of distance. So now that we've shed, some of our colonial ties and some of our reliance elsewhere, we're quite happy in the Asia-Pacific, where our future lies. And what's happened now with trade policy is that geopolitical issues, the Five Eyes, Huawei, defence issues, have sort of got entangled with our trade issues. So I think for us, we were sort of quite happy with regional agreements with RCEP, with APEC. I mean, APEC kept the United States in the Asia-Pacific as a Pacific nation, but was really an invention of South Korea and Australia, as was the G20 finance ministers, to build up something regionally where no one could dominate, and to ensure that Japan and the US were kept in the fold. So the UK joining, I mean, I wouldn't blame them. Why wouldn't you want to join an agreement like that? And an agreement like RCEP is, in terms of share of global GDP and global trade, is close to the EU. Why wouldn't you want to join? And I suspect the precedent issue is the one that would be affecting the UK. Plus, the UK is own case on its own merits. But I mean, you've got to admit the UK was the home of Adam Smith and free trade. They probably should be allowed to join any club they want to join, because they've invented the whole thing, even though the EU lost their first election in the land of Adam Smith after all that.
Robert, I think you wanted to chip in here.
Yes, please, Nick. Thank you. Thank you, Tim, for that. I think there's two things here. One is for the UK, the impact of joining CPTPP will be quite modest. I mean, the UK already has deals with some of these countries in the CPTPP, so it's less about trade than more about geopolitics. And this is, I think, all these trade deals now. I mean, they've always had a bit of geopolitics in, but now I think they've got even more, particularly given the rise of China. And one of the reasons why for Japan, again, it's so important that the UK joins CPTPP, and Japanese government said, we would like to have you in. Of course, there are hurdles to jump through that the UK might find difficult with some of the chapters in the CPTPP. But one of the reasons Japan wants this to happen is because it needs ballast. It needs the support of another big like-minded economy to give it in terms of the rules-based order, as I've been saying, of regulation, standards, governance, and all of that. So it's all about the sort of a far bigger picture than just the trade of goods.
Need to unmute myself before I unmute any of our questioners. I want to call on the first member of the audience to raise their blue hand was Alex Villans. I'll unmute you, and yeah. If you want to ask your question, please go ahead.
Thank you very much all for the webinar. So India was widely regarded as the major goal for RCEP. How likely is it that India will join? Probably not in the near future, perhaps in a few years' time, or perhaps not. To what extent do you think that's affected by Indian domestic regulations? Robert managed to speak to a few of these points earlier, for which thanks, but appreciate it if you could expand. Thank you.
Alicia, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, I just want to add something kind of contrarian, or not that it's my own research, but it's actually a very prominent and influential paper that was written on the gains to be made by RCEP, and it included India. And this is a paper by Plummer and Petrie, which has been widely discussed. And interestingly, they find no gains for India to be made, which is amazing, because you would imagine that, given that tariffs are quite high, by lowering them, you would have that impact, very, very minor positive impact for India, and most interestingly, hardly any for the rest if India were to. Whether this is, actually what would have happened is hard to tell, but my point is that there was no empirical evidence of the weight of this Plummer-Petrie paper that would have shown the opposite, and that's important. And I think one of the reasons is that for these general equilibrium models that were used for this kind of estimate, it all depends on how integrated you are already, and India isn't. And I think India's card, to answer the question, is really much more about, can I do it on my own? What about South Asia? What about that region that for many, many famous geopolitical scientists is actually will be the center of the world, yeah? Why would I run to ASEAN if I have a place here that is not yet integrated and that will be the center of the world? So I think India still has this idea that it can play a much more central role in South Asia than it would play in ASEAN plus China plus South Korea plus Japan. I think this is important because it answers somewhat the question that India might be waiting for its own opportunity, where it can actually just not accept the rules, but set the rules. And given what's happening, in my reading of Biden's push for the Indo-Pacific, and which we thought could be something that might end in itself because of a Trumpian view of the world, not really. It's back, and it's back big time. So the question is, was Modi, sorry to use this word, naive, or was Modi too too clever to see that that could actually happen and he could play a much bigger role. Only time will tell, but I think it's an important question. I don't think we can answer India's decision only on the basis of its closeness to the world, because that should have pushed India to open in a way. Maybe with a huge transition, you have 20 years for many countries in terms of lowering tariffs. They could have asked for even more, but just make the gesture. And they didn't. So I guess they have a plan. I mean, something more than just, I'm not in for any of the deals in the world.
Fascinating, Alicia, thanks. I want to pick up on a topic that we intended to discuss earlier, but it's also been raised in some of the questions, and that's the digital economy. Janet, perhaps I'll start with you on this one. There is a chapter in RCEP that deals with e-commerce, as I think you mentioned earlier, in which the parties agreed not to force companies to locate computing facilities in their countries in order to do business there. That was pretty much it as far as it went. One of our audience members has asked, I mean, beyond this, RCEP has no provisions concerning data exchange and privacy considerations. Will this change in future? What is the perception from the various countries, given that digitalization will disrupt business and society in the future?
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and thanks for the question. It's a really good question, and you know, I think you'll be hearing a lot about the developments in digital services trade in the future. RCEP, as you rightly say, doesn't really have much in terms of digital services or services in general. It does have certain rules about e-commerce. You know, so I think the good thing there is that a lot of the developed countries in RCEP already have rules in place. Maybe they can prompt the emerging markets to develop or stick to the rules around e-commerce as a result of joining RCEP. And also, you know, digital documentation will become a norm. Electronic signatures will be accepted. So all of these, I think, under RCEP are positive developments and will get the discussion started in the right direction. However, because again, RCEP is not binding and there aren't any punitive measures to ensure that countries comply, nothing might actually be done in practice. And RCEP actually allows its members to basically impose whatever national regulatory restrictions, as long as they are not discriminatory between domestic and foreign companies. So, you know, I think in terms of digital services, there is a long way to go. And of course, with the CPTPP, the standards are a lot higher. So, you know, for digital services, for instance, there are some commitments to cross-border information flows, commitments to not actually localize data as a condition for doing business, also not requiring access to source code. But with the RCEP countries, actually, it's all over the map. I mean, they are countries that want data localization. China is a proponent of that, Indonesia and Vietnam. Also, those who want more cross-border trade flows are countries like Japan is a really good example of that. So I don't think that there's any kind of agreement or any, I don't see any imminent prospect of RCEP solving that particular issue. You know what, I think what's really interesting is what's going to happen with China. China, of course, has a lot of digital services advantages in terms of e-commerce. They are really moving forward on digital payments, also artificial intelligence, and they have a lot of data because of a very engaged online population, which a lot of other countries don't have. But at the same time, it's a much more regulated and restricted internet than many of the other countries. And I think China's position in Asia in terms of digital services is really to export its own ICT standards to some of the developing countries that don't mind data localization, think it's a good thing. And China thinks of it as you know, I think some people call it a digital Silk Road. So I think that's going to be China's sphere of influence versus some of the other countries like Japan, like Korea. I mean, they're going to be because they're part of CPTPP, they're going to adhere to these much more liberal cross-border data flow standards. So I see a bifurcation among Asian countries depending on where they stand in terms of data localization versus more liberal cross-border digital flows.
Thank you, Janet. I'd like to take another blue hand from the audience. Yogendra Kumar, you have raised your hand. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you so much. I have two questions. One is that how good are the prospects for the reliable or for resilient supply chains? And the other question actually is that in terms of Australia's, let's say, geostrategy or geoeconomics and geopolitics, I mean, there's a clear contradiction between its Indo-Pacific strategy and its kind of membership of RCEP and closeness in business and economic terms with China, because they're coming into contradiction, and you find that sanctions being on Australia by China, despite the fact they joined the RCEP. So I'm just wondering, how sustainable is that strategy, either in terms of maintaining its economic autonomy or in terms of developing a strategy for some kind of a balance of power in the region? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tim, I know this question was a little bit quiet at the beginning. I think we heard everything towards the end, but there were two parts. What are the prospects for resilient supply chains, and is there a tension between Australia's Indo-Pacific strategy and its close economic relationship with China?
Yeah, thanks very much for both the questions. I think firstly, all nations in RCEP have bilateral relationships with China, and in some ways I don't see that as a contradiction. People belong to regional trade agreements and they have bilateral FTAs, often one bilateral agreement with several countries, such as the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA, can lead to something more regional, which you want it to do. And in some cases, RCEP and CTPP allows countries that otherwise didn't have an agreement, whether it be Japan and China or South Korea and China, actually do have a relationship. So often they can be complementary. With global supply chains, there is some evidence that in some of the literature and some of the policy making material that RCEP will be pretty good for revitalising global supply chains, and I think that's one reason why China was keen to join, and that's one reason why I think ASEAN was keen to raise it. And with respect, I was really interested in Alicia's analysis on India. It's interesting when we've been looking at India and China, not just from a trade, domestic tariff economy point of view, but in terms of the role of Indian companies relative to China's. India after the British left went for a big economic nationalist phase with the Nehru-Gandhi dynasties, and it's not surprising that you see a lot of Indian companies, private companies, on the world stage. Mittal, Tata, Infosys, Dr. Reddy's lads doing a very, very good job. And there's been a lot of Indian foreign investment by private sector Indian companies in Australia, in ASEAN, around the region, without a lot of fuss. Whilst in the case of China, there've been the issue of state-owned enterprises, and therefore are there geopolitical security conditions. So it's interesting the different models of India versus China. China attracting a lot of foreign direct investment for a lot of its time of development, particularly when it was a nation of shippers more than a nation of shoppers. Whilst India developing quite a large international private sector with a lot of success in terms of outward investment, and that's probably something that would play into Alicia's hypothesis about India wanting to be the centre of their region. Certainly in terms of some of their success with the national private sector companies, they would have a case to make that they've gone global quite well on that front, if not in their own domestic economy.
Robert, I know you also want to chip in here, but I've also got a question for you from our chat, and the question comes from Samir Puri. You mentioned already that countries in the region are looking for a middle way in which they avoid the mutual exclusivity of rival blocs. Are there scenarios in which countries in the region, especially smaller countries, might experience rival appeals to their economic loyalties from these different blocs, or can these blocs coexist without such an eventuality coming to pass? So, your thoughts, Robert?
It's a very rich stew of a question there. So thank you, Samir. I just had a couple of points. I want as a coda to Alicia's point about India. And I see absolutely no prospect for India joining RCEP, certainly in the short term. There is no political gain for Modi to be had from this. His policy is around Make in India. You've got Made in China 2025. You've got Make in India. There's a lot of autarky going on in the world at the moment. I see absolutely no prospect of India joining. And of course, India has this non-aligned thing in its DNA, in its national sort of political DNA, that I think will prevent it from joining, even though the door, of course, is very ostentatiously open to India for RCEP. On the Australia, I think what Australia shows, it is vulnerable in commodities, although I suspect ultimately less vulnerable than in the long term than in the short term. There are rare earths in other places. Australia has them. There are new wine markets, particularly in the UK. During lockdown, we've all been enjoying our Australian wine. So thank you very much, Australian wine producers, South African wine producers too, of course. But in the longer term, I suspect these commodities are fungible in terms of where they're sold. The interesting thing, I think, is perhaps Australia's strategy. And I think the more successful strategy with regard to China would have been for Australia to really align closely with other like-minded countries. So again, we have the importance of coalitions in the region, particularly Japan and South Korea on tech, because clearly Australia is vulnerable on tech. So it's about, I think we're going to be hearing more about economic resilience in many different countries from now on. And I think for Australia and other sort of smaller powers, it's coalitions and cross-sector coordination that's really vital there. On Samir's question, of course, you are going to, the smaller countries are going to have sort of the siren calls of China with BRI, DS, the Digital Silk Road, with the US, which may be trying to formulate an alternative to BRI. So of course, there's going to be money, there's going to be influence, there's going to be coercion. So it's all really difficult for these smaller states to navigate. But if you talk to any of the leaders of any of these smaller states, they don't want to have to choose, because of course, if you choose one, it means you antagonize the other, which is why I think we come back again to coalitions in the region, why Japan's role is important, Australia as well, very, very important, why the UK needs to be in the CPTPP. It's all about coalitions. It's all about the middle powers actually exerting their clout and sort of clubbing together and trying to support this, as I've been saying throughout, this rules-based order, openness, freedom of navigation, and all that. So I think the middle powers here have a really important role to play in ensuring that this sort of this binary world doesn't actually come to pass.
I'd like to try to cover two more questions, I think. The first of those from our written questions from Noel Clehane. I'll direct this first, I think, at Janet. The EU and ASEAN have elevated their relationship to strategic partnership, but ASEAN is absent from the Commission's trade policy. And most of Asia, other than China, is also omitted. It doesn't look like the EU will get to doing a region-to-region deal with an Asian bloc. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. And then actually, Alicia might also have some thoughts on that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think the EU right now is focused on getting through the CAI, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment with China. So, and there are other, plurilateral bilateral agreements going on, but I think that that has been the focus of the EU, and we'll hear much more of that by the end of the year. I think a big sticking point is certainly the issue of human rights, which the EU is not necessarily 100% aligned with the US, even though the US wants to come up with a somewhat of a transatlantic coalition to counter China on that. The EU has its own interests, so I think the EU, the prospects of the EU working with Asia more broadly, I think that would be a good thing. I don't think realistically that's going to happen in the near term before it tries to get through the CAI with China, which I think there are some downside risks to it, because some of the European countries are not going to be agreeing holistically to what is agreed upon. There will be a lot of political pushback on that. However, I do want to mention that again, there should be opportunity for Europe and Asia to forge closer ties together, because let's not forget that if you look at RCEP, look at countries' trade balances, this is really an agreement of primarily trade deficit, trade surplus countries looking for trade deficit countries as consumer markets. So that is actually lacking in RCEP. So we talk about market access for China, Japan, Korea, but actually, even these countries, some of them are looking for consumption countries. And so I think that the EU would be kind of a natural fit for this kind of arrangement.
Alicia, I wondered if you wanted to add anything on the prospects of a region-to-region trade deal, but also I'm going to pick up with the last written question, with the sort of countervailing point, which is to what extent are environmental concerns being taken into account in trade policy? To achieve net zero, it makes most sense to trade with close neighbors rather than rely on long distance air or sea transport, which rather runs against the notion of perhaps a region-to-region trade deal with the EU. Less important, perhaps.
Well, it's two good questions. So Europe and carbon neutrality and what to do as regards trade. So to be brief, on the former, I fully agree with Janet. I mean, we just had our investment deal with China end of the year, and I think that's basically still in the making. We don't even have the appendices, and one wonders whether they're still negotiating. So it's just, I think, really too early to even imagine a trade deal. This is just an investment deal, and to be frank, quite limited in scope. Of course, Europe has other choices, or at least the EU. I'll focus on the EU here. Following the UK, or thinking that the EU has its own kind of quote unquote bigger negotiating power to come up with something similar to CPTPP. It has already deals with quite a number of CPTPP economies, the more so if it were to finalize Mercosur and ratify it, because there is of course a couple of Latin American countries, Chile and Mexico there. So basically they could actually literally come up with a clone, if I may say, of a CPTPP with existing deals, yeah, and that's, I think, quite important. We have South Korea, we have Japan, we have Vietnam, I mean, so in a nutshell, that could be a possibility different from negotiating beyond the comprehensive investment agreement with China. So I think the EU can still kind of bifurcate from that decision on investment. And if you read the Commission's mantra, if I may say, on this deal lately, is all about autonomous measures. I mean, it's not so much about explaining the deal anymore. So that's why I would agree that we're very far from any trade agreement, and it might actually bifurcate. So from investment, China, to trade elsewhere in Asia. On the carbon neutrality, I think the key here, and we're having the first signal, not for Europe, which has long discussed the the carbon adjustment tax, but from the US. USRT, and they just kind of, threw that kind of bomb in there to say, we are going to include carbon adjustment tax in our trade deals. And it's quite something if you think about it, because they're moving from not caring in the previous administration to actually going even faster than Europe in introducing this tool. And I do think we're heading there. I think the EU will immediately jump on that wagon. So I think we are going to have not only targets, which is the EU way, like Paris Agreement, to real cost. And I think we're very, very close. If the US pushes for it, the EU will go ahead.
Alicia, thank you very much. Before I thank the whole panel, because we have now come to the end of our time, I'd like to flag that we have another webinar tomorrow, 3 to 4 p.m. UK time. So unfortunately, rather late in the evening in Singapore at 11 p.m. That webinar is Can Europe Defend Itself? Where several panelists will be discussing a debate that has been raging in the IISS journal Survival on the extent to which Europe can defend itself without the United States. This event has been recorded, and along with many of our other webinars, you'll be able to find it online in about 24 hours time. I'd like to thank our panel very much. Thank you, Alicia, Tim, Janet, and Robert. Thank you very much. Thanks as well to my colleagues working behind the scenes, Cleo Dunkley, Tom Wick, and Celia Underlin. And thank you to all of you for joining. Goodbye.